So today I'm going to talk about common property resources. These are pieces of property that we own together for one or the other reason. And probably we can think of most resources in the early history of humanity. Most resources were owned together, or you could say owned by nobody, or owned by the local community. This is referred in Latin law to as res communis, that is properties that are owned in common. And the word enclosure is often used to mean creating private property. I went to school in England and now remember that there were lots of history lessons that were about enclosure, and as a sort of sleepy feeling about this. At the time I wasn't quite as interested as I am now, but there were enormous battles, and I'll come back to that a little bit more. But basically, in what happened in Britain, there used to be fields that were open and where anybody in a village could have their goats or their sheep. And they could also go and collect whatever they could find, plants, medicinal plants or seeds and most importantly grazing, and I suppose perhaps water and so on. Then eventually the usually rich and powerful would enclose these lands, and that was a way of showing that something was private property. You built a fence or a hedge, very often in England, around them. You planted something. That was a way of designating private property. And environmentalists sometimes use the term enclosure in this more general sense, when you create private property. So, of course, in history, if you go back far enough, there was no ownership to 88 megahertz. But you try emitting 88 megahertz today in the center of a town, you'll quickly find out, you'll be sued by someone, and you'll find out that there is an owner today. And so that has been enclosed, that property. It's like someone put up a fence around it and bought it and says, well, now it's mine. And what about the seas? Who owns the seas? Well, we actually had a process in the United Nations that took some 40, 50 years, from about 1930 to 1980, when the countries of the world discussed the big oceans. And they eventually decided that every country had the right to 200 miles of coast, and they drew up maps, and that is the Law of the Seas Convention. And Switzerland, for instance, got nothing. Right. So you could think that is fair or unfair, depending on your viewpoint. Sweden didn't actually get very much either, because the North Sea, every place in the North Sea is always closer to Denmark, England, Norway, than to Sweden. So we lost the North Sea. What about the human genome? Our own DNA. Does someone have the right to patents? Is it possible to create property rights to the information in a DNA molecule? Well, actually, the company Monsanto considers itself not to be the owner of human DNA, but certainly of plant DNA. And if you plant their seeds, if you buy their seeds, you have to sign contracts, basically saying that you don't have the right to do this or that. And so they have the right to some DNA. Well, the examples can multiply. And we are now going to talk particularly about common property resources, which are resources that are not enclosed by a private person nor by a state, but by a community. To the left here we have Garrett Hardin, who published a very famous article called The Tragedy of the Commons. And people say tragedy of the commons like a household word, meaning that, well, if there isn't any clear private ownership, then things just break down. The woman in the middle here, Elinor Ostrom, she got a Nobel Prize a few years ago. She's unfortunately no longer with us. She died a few years ago too, but She made her career and life around proving, in some sense, that Hadrian was not quite correct. There is a tragedy, but the tragedy is when there is open access, that is, when there is no ownership control. But the commons is a word for communal property. And history has shown that villages are able to jointly manage property very nicely, sometimes for thousands of years. And so Eleanor's work was really dedicated to thinking about when is it that these common property resources can be managed, and how should they be managed? How should the fishes in a lake, how should a village manage a lake, for instance? I'll just talk for a moment more about the enclosure of the commons that I mentioned before. In British history, you'll find a lot written on this, and you'll also find some in a textbook for this course, so you can read about this. You can read, for instance, pages 48 to 49 about this, and you'll see some of the history, the struggles about the creation of private property that was usually created at the expense of communal property. And so this is a topic of a lot of ideology and a lot of fighting. Now, as Eleanor would say, common pool resources, that is, resources that can be owned together, they have a certain characteristic. For instance, one of the characteristics is that they are not enormously plentiful. So, for instance, it's not always the best land. The best land has usually been claimed as private a long time ago. Sometimes more marginal lands, meadows on Alps, or some marginal lands in dry areas, for instance, where the productivity per hectare is so low that it really is not economic to pay for fences. And if you can't pay for fences, you don't get private property. This is not the same as open access, however. There's still maybe a community that is deciding. And Eleanor spent her life walking through irrigation systems and fields and fishery in remote places throughout the world, and collected examples. And I will just tell you one or two of those examples. But there's in southern Spain, we have the rivers that flow out through in Valencia, in Murcia, and in Alicante, for instance. And along these rivers, there is a documented collaboration that goes back 500-600 years. These are areas with rather low and rather erratic rainfall, and so the productivity is quite low. And the farmers have had systems of their own where they have managed the water. They will meet every week, very often in the shadow of the church after Mass. And they would take turns, they would elect officials. That's someone called a syndic, for instance, is the chief official. They would have these weekly meetings. They would take turns at using the water. There'd be fixed order. Each farmer can take as much as he likes, but when his turn is over, it's the next person. This taking of turns is a way of monitoring, because then the next guy is waiting and is monitoring me. And when I'm waiting for my turn, I monitor the one before me to make sure that he doesn't waste water. There is fines if you take water out of turn, and they have found the fine books from 1443, for instance, and they can see the structure of the fines. And it's very common to have very low fines initially, and if you repeat your violation, you get tougher fines. And there's also how is the fine used, and some of it is used for the official, some for the person who accuses someone and actually tells that X cheated here. Another example is from a fishery in Alanya in Turkey. where you have about 100 fishermen. And the key here to the monitoring problem and the problem of how to control each other's behavior is that you sort of, instead of taking turns, you you rotate. So there is a list of all the eligible fishermen, and there's a list of all the sites. Each site where you can put your net has a name. And then they draw a lot on the first day, and you get, that's your fishing site for the first day. And then everybody moves east. So there's a rotation. This means that everybody gets the best site one day, and everybody gets the worst site one day, and so forth. Another set of examples that that Eleanor studied have been Alptop meadows. These are not very productive land. That's why they are still sort of semi-forested. They are on the top of mountains, and people would take their cows there in the summer so that they can make hay on the main fields that they own in a village, so that the cows get the cows out of the way, so to speak. They are taken up to the top of these rather steep pastures, and they will spend the time up there in the summer. And so you need a system how to manage this. And one thing that might not sound so nice, but that is there is usually a system of keeping outsiders out. This is an essential element of property rights. You have to be able to exclude people. That applies to common property resources too. If you could not exclude people, then even the best management would not help. Because if you had a great fishing ground, then everybody else would come and move in from outside, and it would no longer be a great fishing ground. It would become overused. So there has to be a way of excluding people. In these meadows, it took maybe generations to become accepted and to get right access to these communal lands. Even if you bought land, you didn't immediately get the access. You had to become a sort of accepted as a member of the community, and that could take a little longer. And then there's lots of details. How many cows do you have a right to send to the meadow? This could be in proportion to how much land you have, or how much hay, or how you contribute to the cooperative. And there are annual general meetings that make the rules and decide. And there are fines. And there are many other rules. And Eleanor put together, after an enormous amount of work, 7 rules that look so simple, but that took a lifetime of research, and that essentially got her a Nobel Prize. One is that you need clear boundaries. You need to be able to exclude people, as I mentioned. Another is that you essentially need locally designated agents, so you elect people locally. The 5th is that you need sort of an arena for conflict resolution, which you can call a court, if you like. So I hope you'll read more about this. Eleanor's work is fascinating. There are nice ways of formalizing this a little bit as a prisoner's dilemma kind of game, for instance, using game theory. So you can read about this on page 120 to 121. You'll see how the prisoner's dilemma has no solution. That's why it's called a prisoner's dilemma. There are 2 strategies, and if both play the right strategy, then both win a lot. But when they take their decisions individually, they have an incentive to deviate, and if they both deviate, they both lose a lot. So there is no solution. In game theoretic terms, the Nash and the Pareto optima are in separate places. But the interesting thing is that if you play a prisoner's dilemma game every day of your whole life, and you know that your children are going to play the same game in a village that we call a repeated prisoner's dilemma, that maybe does have a solution. And that solution has to do with the evolution of trusts, collaboration, and communal property. So There's a lot of interesting work to read about there. Thank you.